the first example of the relationship between the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and women folk in Arabia was the relationship he had with his wife Khadijah bin Wahab. Khadijah was 15 years older than the Prophet. The Prophet Muhammad was 25 years old, she was 40 years old. The Prophet was an employee of Khadijah. We don't say that too much. Remember, he was younger and he was working for her. We don't like to say that. Many of the Muslim men don't even want to hear that. Some of the Muslim women don't want to hear that. They just want to do like this. We don't want to hear that. But that's part of the historical record. This was 15 years before he became a prophet. Take that into account. 15 years before he became a prophet, the Prophet Muhammad was working for this woman. He was an employee of his wife. And that's a point which Muslim men have to deal with, and Muslim women. We recognize the Prophet was exalted, he was the example, but he was a human being like all of us. 15 years is a long time. In America, many marriages don't last even 5 years. So they were living together as husband and wife in a monogamous relationship for 15 years before he became a prophet. Working for her. And that affects the example that he set for the other Muslims. After he became a prophet at age 40, he lived with this woman most of his time. This is where the Orientalists who say nasty things about the Prophet ﷺ, that he likes to marry women and all that. This man was a young man of 25. And he married this woman for 15 years before he became a prophet. And this woman stayed with him when he was over 50 years old. That's a fact, part of the historical record. So the relationship between the Prophet and his wife, Khadijah, became a very useful example in the relationship between him and the Prophet. That's become very important. Second thing that is very important here when we look at the relationship between the Prophet and his wife Khadijah is that his wife Khadijah became a faithful supporter of the Prophet throughout his mission. She was well-to-do, and she did not only support him financially, but emotionally and psychologically. When the Prophet went to Mount Hira and he was confronted by Gabriel, he went to the household. Ya ayyuhal muzammil, ya ayyuhal muddathir. Who comforted her? Him, when he was in that period. It was his wife. So that also changed the nature of the relationship. Now, in the Western literature, you will see many of these Orientalists who will say, well, he married all these women. But if you look at the Prophet, he married only after the death of Khadijah. And he was in his 50s. And now you all live together today, you know that. Many of the men, by the time they're 50 years old, so the Prophet Muhammad, so when people, in the West, they try to emphasize this side of the Prophet. They don't do justice to the man. He did not marry any other woman until the death of Khadijah. And those women he married, like Hafsa, Aisha, Safiya, the Jewish girl, Maryam from Egypt, all these women came into his life as widows who needed protection and the Prophet contracted political marriages. Even some of his opponents who write against him in the feminist literature acknowledge that fact, that these were not young girls. Aisha was the young one. But all the others were married before. So really, the relationship between the Prophet and these wives serve as model for Muslim men after him. And it explained the relationship between man and woman that existed in Arabia before Islam, and how those errors of Jahiliyyah were to be corrected. And the Prophet set a good example in correcting the excesses and the blunders of Jahiliyyah days. Now, the other point that needs to be understood here with regard to the role and place of women during the time of the Prophet is the fact that women in the immediate house of the Prophet were not only psychological, moral, and emotional supporters of the Prophet, as we know from the stories about the wives of the Prophet, and you have thousands of books written about them. You can see that they became role models for other women in the Islamic tradition, and they were called the mothers of the believers.